I am, as Jim said, a recovering academic, which is an oxymoron. You don't ever get over that circumstance. You know, it's there for life. And he's quite right. I taught at Rhodes and then was sent over to its sister institution, the Memphis College of Art, to serve as its academic dean. And I did that for 6 years. And I told Vera yesterday, coming from the airport, I woke up one morning and thought, so help me God, if I have to chair one more curriculum committee meeting, I'm going to kill somebody. At which time I knew it was time to quit and go do something else. The something else, of course, was publishing, where I spent 35 years in publishing and was happily retired. And at some point, I'm going to turn into a writer. I retired at 59 to be a writer, and it lasted 13 months before Publishers Weekly called. And those were the days in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, when suddenly, for the first time in history, religion books were commanding the market. The bestsellers, if you will remember, those of you who can, from 1991, we were being touched by angels and embraced by light and running off to heaven, and we were all becoming Jew-boos. Some of us Jew-boos with Christocentric proclivities, which, you know, God knows what that means. Esalen was coming along, Hazelden. All of them were being published by religion houses, like Westminster and John Knox, which at that time weren't together, or Augsburg Fortress, or Abington. And suddenly the money was all going, as far as secular publishing was concerned, all going to the wrong place. And so they pressured the industry magazine, Publishers Weekly, to please tell them, as they so inelegantly put it, what the hell is going on? Consequently, I got the phone call that said, would you come and establish a Department of Religion? I said, why me? And the editor said, because you know publishing and we think you know God, which I thought was less than a good affirmation. My only claim to knowing God other than personal was that I had an undergraduate degree in Greek and Latin, which is as practical as I don't know what. What in the world does a single woman do with Greek and Latin? You don't want to go there. Anyway, I can read Greek. I could read Greek. It's so arthritic now I have to use a pony. But nonetheless, so I started. All of this is a long way to saying the first thing I wanted to say, and Jim sort of set it up for me perfectly. The first thing I want to say is we are indeed going to be talking about emergence Christianity, and that's G-E-N-C-E. It is not int or unst or inging or anything. It's G-E-N-C-E. It's emergence, and it matters. It didn't used to. It matters now. We're going to be talking about that because that's what we're here to talk about. I think, however, I discovered some 6 or 8 months ago, after all these years of doing this, that I had not made it always clear to audiences. This is not an endorsement of emergence Christianity. I'm not here to sell you a bill of goods. I came into this strictly out of a perfectly happy retirement, all right, to deal with my industry, the publishing industry, to the best of my knowledge, to try to explain what in the world was going on. It only took about 18 months to establish a department in a magazine like Publishers Weekly, which has been around 150 years, which is a trade journal, which isn't going to go anywhere. It only takes about 18 months and a good deal of money to establish a department. But within 18 months, what was clear was that it wasn't a department that was needed, it was somebody who would indeed answer the question. And because I was a former academic, I went looking for the research. So what we're looking at now is based on 50 years of more or less academic, lay academic, if there be such a thing, research into what in the world is happening and why it's happening. It's not to say, I won't, unless somebody wants me to, but I can make you a laundry list of things that are scary about emergence, things give me a little pause. There's some things I outright don't like. But it is imperative, I think, or I wouldn't be here. It is imperative that we look at what's happening, that we acknowledge what's happening. And to that good end, and because we have the luxury of 3 days together, I want to be sure that right now, this morning, though it may bore you out of your gourd, it's going to make me happy, okay? If I can, and I'm the one that, no, whatever. Anyway, I want to be sure we've got some things really clear. The first of all thing is, I just said, we're talking about emergence Christianity, G-E-N-C-E, and it truly does matter. One division of emergence Christianity is emerging, I-N-G. Another is emergent, G-E-N-T, and they aren't the same anymore. That's why it matters that we know what we're talking about. We who belong to the Reformed tradition, and I love being an Episcopalian, but I have to confess my sins. I was born and reared a Presbyterian. For the first 17 years of my life, I was a member of Presbyterian Church USA, well, U.S. But when I was 17, I got saved. No, I saw my first set of red doors and said, "Thank you, Lord, I'm home." There's one Episcopalian, I'm playing to the audience. She brought the emblem of St. Andrew's cross so we'd see that there was. I shall always be enormously grateful for those 17 years. Most of what I know about the Bible was taught to me by my Presbyterian parents and by my Presbyterian first 17 years. They were very important. Episcopalianism, Anglicanism is wonderful, but we don't know how to teach the Bible in near the way, yes, she's agreeing even, in near the way that those Presbyterian years did, the teaching of the Scripture. And so, anyway, all of that is to say that we who are in part of that tradition tend to think of Protestantism as being one overarching rubric, and that's as it should be. Protestantism means a very discrete sense of things, and we can tell people what Protestantism is. But we also recognize under that overarching rubric that there's a thing called Presbyterians, and a thing called Episcopalians, and a thing called Methodists, and a thing called Baptist, and a thing called Lutheran, and that they are not the same. And we can distinguish them one from the other, as well we should. And not a one of them thinks that he or she is the Homogullah, except Baptist, and they tend to think they're the Homogullah. But with that exception, and I have 2 Baptist degrees, so I can laugh at them. With that exception, we make those distinctions in the same way. It is imperative before we go very far that we understand that emergence Christianity is what is happening. It is the Christianity of the great emergence, if that makes you feel better. In the same way that Reformation faith is the faith that came out of the Great Reformation, okay? And emergence Christianity has some 8 or 10, certainly 7, perfectly discrete. They're not denominations. They would be if they were Protestant. They are distinguishable segments or component elements or whatever you want to call them. Don't call them denominations. Once you get out of this room, if you hit an emergence, they'll kill you for that one. So don't make that mistake. But they are segments. And the first of which, the oldest of which in this country anyway, is emerging Christianity. The second to come along was emergent Christianity. And then after that, we were off and running. Neo-monastic is probably the fastest growing segment or division of emergence Christianity. And in this town, you have a beautiful example of it in the simple way. If you're not Pittsburghian, or even if you are and don't know anything about it, look up when you get home, Google The Simple Way or Shane Claiborne. A very important thing that is happening. He is probably the leader of that movement, along with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove from Rutba House in North Carolina, who you might also want to look up. Together they lead that movement in this country. There are literally thousands of neo-monastic units and cohorts and divisions and communities in this country alone. They are not only growing, they fascinate me because they are the first, they and Fresh Expressions are the first division of emergence Christianity to begin to develop an international core. There's a thing called the Community of Communities. It is based online, as are most emergent things, but occasionally they will meet physically, in physical space, instead of in virtuality, in physicality. They will meet together. But they indeed do have an international network and an international presence now. For that reason, they're important. They're also important because they're the first division, so far as I can tell, they're the first division within emergence Christianity to produce a body of work for liturgical use, a manual of praxis, if you want to call it that, whatever you want to call it. If you were Episcopalian, I would say the analog is for the Book of Common Prayer. In the same way that Anglicanism came up out of the Reformation and established very quickly its identity by getting the Book of Common Prayer. So neo-monastics, with Claiborne and Wilson Hartgrove as the compilers of the book, produced about 18 months ago a thing called Common Prayer for Ordinary Radicals. I call it to your attention seriously. It's a doorstopper of a book. But if you've got, and some of you are shaking, you've already got it, obviously. If you've got any interest at all in where liturgy is going, not only within emergence, but within emergence times, it would pay you to look at that. It would pay you specifically to look at the movement back away from public worship to domestic worship. One of the things that emergence is beginning to urge and beginning to realize is the loss of the domestic transmission of the faith and the need to bring it back. The British call it, the British emergence call it the tent synagogue temple syndrome, which is to say that the tent and the synagogue can never substitute for each other. Abrahamics have always begun in the tent, and they have gathered publicly in the synagogue, and once a year or thereabout they would go to the temple. And it is a paradigm or a way of flow that emergents are urging upon all of us, especially the neo-monastics. The fourth group that comes to mind immediately is Fresh Expressions. It's an unfortunate term, I think, because originally Fresh Expressions were all emergence churches. That's a specific division. They too are international. They do have something close to a physical office in London, at Canterbury, in England. There is also, as Jim said, missional church. There is deep church. There is also, just to disconcert you, cyber church. And we need to be aware as we go into what we're talking about that some 20 million of our fellow Americans had their whole religious experience last year on the net in virtuality. They never entered physicality. And they did their worshiping there. And if we have time, we will go back to cyber church because it's worth our attention, because it's going to change canon law considerably. And so they're hyphenateds, which are also growing very rapidly. Hyphenateds, it's a strange name. There's a brand new book from Chalice Press I call to your attention just on the hyphenateds. Hyphenateds are, in your case, Presbymergence, in my case, Anglo-emergence, in other cases, Baptist-emergence or Meth-emergence, which sounds like a bad drug every time I say it, but that's okay. What you've got, originally they were Metho, M-E-T-H-O hyphen G-E-N-T, and Presbo, P-R-E-S-B-Y-O-M-E-R. They got rid of the hyphens about 5 years ago, but they kept the name of hyphenated. And so if you want to see what it looks like in the Presbyterian Communion, go Google Presbymergence, all one word, and you will find hundreds of them. Those are the divisions. The point is that we need to be aware that we're talking about a complex which is far more analogous to the Reformation or to like this, or to Protestantism, than it is to a particular division thereof. We are talking about an overall thing. We are talking about something that's coming up out of the thing called the Great Emergence. And that's where I really want to begin. See, you thought I had started. I'm just now starting. The Great Emergence. The Great Emergence is the fact that everything in our lives has so dramatically changed that your great-grandfather or your great-great-grandfather could not function in the society that you live in right now. Now, it is very true. My favorite Carol Burnett joke has to do with the fact that kids and their grandparents, there's always been generational lags. Kids and their grandparents, you know, it's always been a jump in there. But what she used to say, if you will remember, is that kids and their grandparents get along so well because they have a common enemy. And that's to some extent true. But the point is, what we have is more than that kind of generational rub. What we have is an entirely different thing. Every 500 years, and now on this, hear me well, every 500 years, those cultures that received their Christianity through the Latin language, as opposed to the Syriac or the Greek traditions, those parts of the world who received their Christianity through the Latin language, or were colonized by those who so received, or were colonialized by those who so received, or were susceptible to so receiving, every 500 years go through an enormous upheaval. You can call it a whoopee, you can call it a tsunami, you can call it, we have a bishop in the Episcopal Church, Mark Dyer, who calls it a rummage sale, and who says with a straight face, if you want to understand what's happening in the church today, you first need to understand that every 500 years we just feel compelled to have a rummage sale, and we're having one. Now, that's both lucky and unlucky for you and me. It means that we have to be aware of what's happening and why it's happening if we're going to shape what's coming, because if history holds, and it probably will, if history holds, what we do now, what we do, as a matter of fact, in the next 90 years, is going to affect what happens in the 400 years that come after that. And that's not overstating the case. That's true. If you go back 500 years from right now, you hit the Great Reformation, right? Which I grew up, and you grew up, some of you, calling the Reformation. It became the Great Reformation when we got the Great Emergence. Don't argue with academics. If they want a great, let them have it, you know? And so it's the, God help you if you don't put the great there, though. Okay, it's the Great Reformation. If you go back 500 years from that, you hit what? The Great Schism, or schism, according to where your mama grew up and taught you to say it. I've never known which one was right. But anyway, it's always had its great. If you go back 1,500 years, you hit the Great Decline and Fall. Thank you, Edwin Gibbon. He wrote a book about it, as a matter of fact. If you go back 2,000 years from right now where we are, you hit the Great Transition. And we changed even the dating of the era. Now, having gone this far, we need to sidebar just long enough to say, if you listened a minute ago, I very carefully said in those parts of the world that were subjected to, or that were susceptible, which is to say, if there were a good rabbi in the room, he or she would stand up and say, what you just described is not a Christian phenomenon. It is a Judeo-Christian one. Because if you go back 500 years from the Great Transition, you hit what? The Babylonian captivity. You hit the destruction of the First Temple and the coming of Second Temple Judaism. And if you go back 1,000 years from the Great Transition, or 500 years from the fall of the temple, you hit the end of the age of Judges and the establishment of the Davidic dynasty, out of which Meshach was to come. And so they would argue that it is Judeo-Christian. They would also call your attention, and I would call your attention, to the fact that what we are concerned about when we are concerned about emergence Christianity is hardly our problem alone. Conservative Judaism in this country has been, in North America, as a matter of fact, both in Canada and this country, has been heavily affected by emergence culture. And there is now a thing called emergence Judaism. If you want to see it, and I hope some of you will, if you want to see it in its funny form, go look up Punk Torah on Google. If you want to see it in its praxis form, look at Synagogue 3000. And if you want to see it at a deadly serious level of rabbi talking to rabbi and theologian to theologian, then look at Forward for February of last year, where the whole month, and it's a net-based also as well as print, the whole month was given over by conservative Judaism to a conversation about emergence Judaism and what it was going to do. And if you really want to see it, go look at a book that has just been released by the Rabbinical Assembly called The Observant Life, The Wisdom of Conservative Judaism for Today. It's a fascinating statement of what's happening to Judaism. Now, having said that, let me also say, if there were an imam in the room, he would at this point also rise and say, and I've had him do it 4 times, so I've learned to do it before yes, some of you are shaking your heads up and down, yes. He would rise and say, it is not Judeo-Christian. It is an Abrahamic phenomenon you are talking about, because Islam has the same 500-year cycle. Now, they're 650 years out of sync with the rest of us. There's no question about that. They're 650 years out of sync because it's 650 of the Common Era before you have a thing you can say, this is Islam. Yes, by 650 the Prophet is dead. By 650 Jerusalem has fallen. There's no question. But it's 650 before you can really say, oh, right now, here is a religion. And if you begin at 650 and go every 500 years, you will arrive at the same sort of cycle. Now, I don't know enough about Islamic history to be able to cite those for you. I can tell you that right now, their great thinkers and are beginning to say that what they are approaching now is something analogous to our 14th and 15th century. That they are in the thing called a peri-reformation, that they are entering about 150 years, which will lead to something analogous to our Reformation. If you want, and they will very quickly say that those who interpret Arab Spring or who interpret the birth of Islamicism without understanding the historical context are misunderstanding what it's about. that Arab Spring is our 14th and 15th century being replayed in this time, and we need to be aware of that. Now, in terms of scholars whom you may look up, Mohammed Iqbal, Iqbal, or you can look up the Iranian Luthers if you want to Google them that way. Probably Abdul Karmin, Abdulkarmin, Abdul Karmin Soroush, Soroush. Notable speakers. They will lead you to a whole bevy, 20 or 30 brilliant Islamic scholars who are now working from the principle that, yes, we are in emergence, but they too are going through something analogous to our Reformation. So, having said all of that, we're in a time of the Great Emergence. What is the Great Emergence? The Great Emergence is a cataclysmic shift in every single thing we have known in life as it was 150, 200 years ago has totally changed. It is the Great Emergence that Thomas Friedman can say the world is flat, and everybody understands. It's the Great Emergence that Fakrit Zakaria, who is the economic analyst for Time and CNN, can talk about Greece catching a cold and all of Europe getting pneumonia from it and diagnose it as a case of mergenomics. It's the Great Emergence that there were in the turn of the last century, there were 8,000 cars in this whole country. There are 8,000 on this campus right now, probably, right? Yeah. It's the Great Emergence that the vast majority of us live at least 40 miles from the place where we grew up. The result is that the conservatory effect of the village is lost on us. We have become totally urbanized. It is the Great Emergence that this year over half of the children born in this country to women under 30 will be born to women who are unmarried by choice, which means they want the baby and not the nuisance, and I understand that, but nonetheless, nonetheless, I mean, I had 7 kids by the same man, and you wouldn't believe the imagination it takes to pull that one off, but so I understand, but it's a huge shift. It's a huge shift. It is the Great Emergence that Wikipedia is more accurate than Britannica. One of the things that bothered me when Britannica shut down its print edition a couple of months ago was that it blamed sliding sales, which undoubtedly was true, but without acknowledging the fact that scholar after scholar, and there are footnotes from here to downtown on this one, scholar after scholar has been able to establish that Wikipedia is infinitely more accurate than is the print edition of Britannica. Why? Because information changes so quickly that none of us can be an expert anymore. Because Wikipedia is done by communal effort. Because Wikipedia is changed almost every single day by people who know what they're talking about in that little area. One of the characteristics of emergence Christianity, one of its most significant ones is it no longer believes in the expert. It no longer believes in the expert because nobody is anymore. One of the signs of the Great Emergence that fascinates me the most is that in May of 10, the Great China Brain Project went through the petaflap. Aren't you fascinated? This year, because it's 2012, the Great China Brain Project, which is owned by IBM, our country, and China, the Great China Brain Project, just to celebrate the fact it's 2012, is going to go through 12 petaflaps. What's a petaflap? A petaflap is when a single computer can do, I have no idea what I'm telling you in terms of what it means, but I know what it means, okay? When one single computer can do a quadrillion procedures in 1 second correctly. You could wire everybody in the United States together, and we could not do that. Do you understand the significance of that? 12 quadrillion procedures in 1 second by one machine accurately. As human beings, we have no way of doing anything with that. There cannot be experts in that kind of world. There can only be communal effort. It's the Great Emergence, while we're on information, that we have 5 times more words in the English language than Shakespeare did when he wrote the plays. because we have 5 times more things to name. It's the great emergence that the kid who goes into technical school in September is going to have everything he learns his first 2 years obviated by the time he or she is a junior. Will be totally inaccurate and useless, except to have got him from September of this year to June of year after next. That's all it will have done. That's the kind of world we're living in. Now, you can also make some funny things about it. The majority of us no longer live, a man, his wife, and their children, and that's not funny. But I have a friend who feels obliged to collect definitions of the Great Emergence, and who last November sent me a whole catch of them. And she said, you know you're living in the Great Emergence when you have 15 cell phone numbers for your 3-member family. And she's right. And you know you're living in the Great Emergence when you turn into your driveway, the first thing you do is call people in the house from your cell phone to come help unload the groceries. And my absolute favorite of last November's catch was, you know you're living in the Great Emergence when you poke your PIN number into the microwave and can't figure out why the damn thing doesn't turn on. And I have treasured that one ever since November. I thought, why didn't I think of that one? But the point is made. And the significant point is that people who are 40 and under are not going to go back to a time that wasn't emergence culture. They can no more go back to the way it was than they can change the color of their eyes. The fascinating thing for me watching this is that people 60 or 65, somewhere and over, are beginning to get emergence really, really well. If you go into emergence gatherings and into emergence worship services, now something close to 1/3 of the people gathered there are as white-haired as I am. I find that fascinating. If I were not 78 going on 79, I would say it was senile dementia. I'm a little leery of that anymore. I don't use that term very often. But it's an incredible thing that's happening. Our older folk are beginning to understand something of what's happening back here. They are beginning. Now, whether it's the people in the middle don't have the chance or the opportunity or the freedom, I don't know what it is. But over 60 or 65, and there are a lot of white hairs in this room, there's impunity somehow. You're not going to build a career. I should worry about my career at this stage. You're not building a career. You're not trying to earn a living by and large. You're free to you have the money to have the technology to play with, and you have the freedom to ask the questions. So as Emergence Church develops in this country, I'm increasingly convinced it's going to be the 40 and 45s under, and it's going to be the 60 and 65s over, who are going to see what this thing is about. Now, the Great Emergence, then, is a total change in everything we do. The 500-year cycle has a cycle interior to itself. That is to say, if you look at the 500-year cycles, you don't have to look very far, before you realize that there is a period of about 150 years prior to the thing itself, which is clearly a lead-up to the thing itself. Now, the thing itself usually has a date because, again, academics are happier if they have a date. We're happy to say that the Reformation began on October 31st of 1517. Now, you know and I know that's not true. That's the date in which Martin Luther said, I've had it, and actually posted the 95 complaints that made the Reformation work. But there was 150 years up to that where you can clearly see it happening. It's called the Peri-Reformation. We have a Peri-Emergence. I hope tomorrow to look at it because I think it's helpful to see it. We have a Peri-Emergence. Our Peri-Emergence began in 1842, when 43 and 44. 1842 is the year when William Faraday, a practicing chemist, meaning a pharmacist, retired. 43 is the day he sat in his study as a retired man and figured out what he wanted to say. And 1844 is the year in which he said it. And what he said was called field theory. And field theory in which he just took electricity and conductivity and gravity and said, they're not acts of God or the angels. They are absolutely part of the physical world, and here's the formula that explains them. And the minute he did that, he converted electricity from Job being angry and throwing things at human beings who are offended, or from Yahweh doing that. He turned it into something that we enjoy all the time. Everything in this room, every single thing in this room has been affected by Faraday. It has been affected by electricity. There is nothing here. If you are in pure cotton, I'll promise you it was run by an electric loom when it was woven, and it was probably at some stage processed by an electrical thing. Everything changes with Faraday. So it's the beginning of our peri-emergence, in the same way that there was a beginning to the Reformation that's called the Reformation. There's a 150-year lead up to the thing itself. If you want to know what the Great Emergence is going to be dated from, and I hate this, it's being dated from 9/11. I fought that for months, 2 or 3 years as a matter of fact. I think it's an unfortunate dating. But scholars are increasingly seeing 1517 is going to have its analog in our 9/11. And where scholars are going to say 20 centuries from now or 200 years from now, that's where it began. The peri-emergence was over with 9/11. We are now into the next part of the cycle. After the 150 years that leads up to the event itself, there is a period of about 100 years, and we're into it now, we're 10 years into it, in which we try to decide what's going on and where we're going to go with this thing. We try to reestablish the authority. It is the business of the peri, whether it is the peri-Great Schism or the peri-Reformation or the peri-emergence, it is the business of that 150 years to disestablish whatever has had the authority and to knock it down. It is the function of the next 100 years in the cycle to re-answer the question, where now is our authority? It is the business of the next 250 years to live with that established authority, even though they don't necessarily like it. When they become so restless that the whole thing starts again and we go into 150 years of peri whatever it's going to be. Most of us are familiar with the Reformation, so I want to look at it because I think it'll be more comfortable. I want to say to you that the peri-Reformation is sometimes by scholars dated with the beginning of the death of John Wycliffe in 1358. I think that's pushing it. I don't know, but I'm perfectly willing to live with it. There's no question that by 1390, the peri-Reformation is in full swing. By 1390, you have 3 armed popes running around the south part of Europe, Alexander, Clement, and Urban, running around the south part of Europe, raping and burning and pillaging. All of them claiming that the chair of Peter was there by divine right, that they had been endowed and ordained by God to hold the chair of Peter. Now, unless God's schizophrenic, 2 of them are wrong. And it doesn't take a genius to see that. The thing that's up for grabs is that from the Great Schism at 1054 right up until 1390, it has been the papacy that was the new authority. It was the papacy that had been established. In 1390, when those 3 gentlemen go at each other, we have arrived at the first moment in which we realize that the authority we have lived under for the last 250 or 350 years, depending on where you date it, the authority we have lived under is no longer credible because 3 people claim it cannot be. And from 1390 on, you go whoop, 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 right up to 1517, watching civilization get down, get rid of the papacy, get rid of the magisterium, get rid of the curia as the ultimate authority of how to live. And you know that history as well as I do. You know, for instance, that, Constantinople fell. In 1451, 52, 53, and 54, it was falling. And when that happened, what happened? All of the great geniuses of European letters, all the Greek scholars, all the great theologians who had been in Constantinople where they were safe, suddenly had to come back into Europe. And what do you get? What do you get? You get the influx of them. You get the Septuagint for the first time. What a concept. We have the Septuagint back for the first time. You get Plato and Aristotle. Europe had been in the Dark Ages. Plato should have stayed in Constantinople. That's my private opinion. But anyway, Christianity had been better off. But we get them back. We get what's called the birth of humanism, right? What did the Reformation bring us? We as Protestants tend to think the Reformation brought us Protestantism. If you will remember in high school when they first taught you about the Reformation, they said Reformation was the coming of humanism, right? It was the birth of the middle class. It was the rise of the nation state. It was the birth of capitalism. And by the way, it gave us Protestantism, which is what these things are. They are across the board. Everything changes. Every part of life, including the religion. And so what you've got, what you've got now is the beginning of the change in religion with those three men running around, arguing that it's for them and they are it. And you go from there to Constantinople's fall, and then you go to what, 1457? When some fool, who clearly was not an Episcopalian, because none of us would ever have done this, took a perfectly good wine press and put grapes in it instead of paper. No Anglican would be caught dead doing that. But nonetheless, it becomes the printing press. Analogous in many ways to what happened with the internet in this one. And so thing after thing. By 1507 and 08 and 09, we have Copernicus circulating his ideas. He's smart enough not to publish them broadly until after 1517, but those ideas that, we're not the center of the universe. Those ideas were floating around long before he gets ready to publish them publicly. And the one that bothers me the most, and I think it's significant, in all of the upheaval from the death of Wycliffe or the coming of the three contenders for the Pope, wherever you want to date the Peri-Reformation, whether you date it in 1358 or whether you date it in 1390, from then on, everything that people had believed and known and built their lives around got shifted. Not only did their economy, not only did their sociology, not only did their intellectual life, not only all of that changed. But before we close for today, I always do this. I want to make a point that one of the parts of the Peri-Reformation that mattered the most was a man named Christopher Columbus, who went sailing on a perfectly flat earth. Nobody really thought it was flat. Doesn't take a kid with a boat, a toy boat, watching it go off to the waters, understands that it goes somewhere. By 1492, people knew it was curved. But the church taught it was flat. The church taught that it was flat and stacked. Hell, earth, heaven. When he sailed away and then had the audacity not to fall off that flat earth and came back, he forced us into a decision. We had to decide with the facts, or we had to decide with the authority that had been established. We're going to go with the facts, right? Clearly, it's a curved earth. We now know it. We cannot argue it. That's fine. So the church is going to have to change what it teaches, right? Wrong. If you are a peasant, we can tell the groaning of the church right now as it tries to face facts is just pathetic. But the sad thing is, if you are just an ordinary citizen, and there are records of this, 2 or 3 anyway. If you were just an ordinary Joe, not overly educated, not anything, but you had built your life as a Christian, and say you live in London, for instance, which is where the records are. You live in London, and you're middle-aged, and suddenly the earth that was this way and that you understood goes this way. And why does it matter? It matters because if it's this way, and my Lord died in Jerusalem and ascended to heaven this way, and I die in London and ascend this way, I will never see my Lord. What I'm saying to you is, regardless of what we do with the information about emergence, regardless of what we go from here thinking about the future of the church, if we ever forget to act pastorally, may God have mercy on us. Because what we are playing with here is 2 things. We're playing with the absolute necessity to inform ourselves about what's happening so we can function intelligently. And we're functioning with the heritage of people who will not be able to change. and whom essentially we're cutting off at the knees when we come forth with some of this. And it better be done prayerfully. It better be done prayerfully. All right. We are to 10:30, and I suspect I better quit. We will go tomorrow, God willing. I want to look at the peri-emergence. I want to show you what happened. I want to say to you that Martin Luther, when he brought down the Curia, when he stood there on the steps of Wittenberg, by the way, he did not tack them on the door. Isn't that awful? It's like George Washington, the cherry tree. It didn't happen, but it makes you feel good. But he did post them. He did post them. When he stood there, as is always happens when the date of one of these things is clear, when it really is, there, and it's 1054 and the schism has happened, and it's 1517 and he's posted them. When that moment happened, there was a resounding silence. And there always is. And that silence was, where now is our authority? Because what Luther had said is no more papacy, no more curia, no more magisterium. They're not calling the rules anymore. They're not making them, not calling the shots. And so the question is, who is? And as you know, Luther answered sola scriptura, scriptura sola. Only the Scripture and Scripture only. Now, he's one of the most risible figures in all of Christian history, isn't he? And he obviously didn't know that sola meant only in Latin, because he got 5 of them, and you can't have 5 solas. So he did have sola gratia, sola fides. But it was sola scriptura that took. Sola scriptura became the authority for the next, right up until Faraday, as a matter of fact, for the next 350 years. Sola scriptura became the authority. Now, should Luther, risible or not, should Luther be blamed for what happened? No. Sola scriptura was never meant to become Protestant inerrancy. That's our problem. Our ancestors did that. That was not what he was talking about. But it became that, and then it became biblical inerrancy. I was talking to one of our bishops the other day who said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with biblical inerrancy except the biblical part and the inerrant part. The rest is fine. And he was right. He was absolutely right. So when we come together tomorrow, we will be looking at Protestant inerrancy or biblical inerrancy, whatever you want to talk about it and call it, which is the authority that Faraday took the first chip at. And we're going to be looking at how it was chipped. Not because I think it's fun to be an iconoclast, although I do, but that's not the point here. Not because of being an iconoclast, but because I think it's imperative we understand how we got from Faraday to here, or how we got from biblical inerrancy to here, how we got where we are, and what it is we're building on and why. And so we will look at that together tomorrow in the hope that on Wednesday we'll be able to say, and so now what? Where is it going? And why does it matter, and what is our role? Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, I objected. The British were the first who did that. And I objected because I think, maybe it was chauvinistic on my part. I think it seems to me it's an American event, and it's odd to me to give it that kind of stature. Their argument was twofold, that it was not an American event, it was a worldwide event. That it especially affects, you can say that emergence or these whoopies or whatever happen in Western world. I object to that, which is why I make this huge thing about Latin language, and which is accurate. Latin language colonized, colonialized. It's not Western world we're talking about, but by and large it is very close to westernized world, if you will, or first world, and I hate that term too. But the Brits argued that regardless of what you call it, that part of the world that falls under that rubric was affected by 9/11. The second argument they make is that since the coming of, and I hate this, since the coming of Islam, each of our tsunamis, 3 at that point? Each of our tsunamis or remedials has begun with a major clash with Islam, and that this follows the pattern. I am not excited, but it's not mine to, I can't change the academic world. I can holler and protest, but it is true, and they're absolutely right.
It wasn't clear to me why they used
Yeah, and the argument, the farther we've gotten away from, it's only been about the last 4 or 5 years that they have wanted 9/11 to be the moment, to be the 15/17 for us. And the farther I've gotten away from it, the more I've calmed down. It takes me a long time to calm down. 5 years is a pretty good record for calming down. The more I have been persuaded, maybe they're right. It has obviously affected the whole world in every way. And so why not? The other thing is that the Martin Luther of emergence is an American, and he shouldn't be. It's very strange that it should be, because emergence comes to this continent last. I spent about half my life jumping the Canadian border, and the best I can tell, the Canadians are about 30 minutes behind us. We're tracking about the same. You can see emergence in Belgium in the 1920s. You see the first of it in the 1920s. It's in Africa now and has been for 4, 5, 6 decades. If you want to look at it, it's Amahoro, A-M-A-H-O-R-O, is emergence in Africa. In South America, it's Emergente Generación or La Rad del Camino, where it's been, all of those are westernized or whatever you want to call it. So they're there. And so, yes, there's every right on the part of the Brits to say, this is not yours to claim, but the event did affect all of us and change everything for us. And so be it. And clearly, there's no question in my mind that we are into that 90 years now, into that century in which we answer the authority question. We're hard at it. So they almost have to be right, that it came somewhere around the turn of the millennia. And 9/11 is as good as any. We tend to think of this as our baby. We really are the Johnny-come-latelys. It truly is all over that part of the world that I described. And we're just now finding out what it means in this country. We're protected by too much Puritanism and fundamentalism, probably, to have got it earlier. So, yes, sir.
Perhaps you're going to talk about this in the next 2 days, but what's going on in the Roman Catholic Church right now, the sexual stuff aside.
Yeah. The sexual stuff aside. Yeah, taking on nuns, he's got to be crazy. I mean, God almighty. We affectionately refer to him as the German Shepherd, and which I think he deserves, to tell you the truth. Matthew Fox, if that means anything to you, the curmudgeon of all curmudgeons, actually every once in a while does something truly brilliant. And he wrote a book in last March, I guess, about how Ratzinger, and he didn't call him Benedict, how Ratzinger is going to destroy the church and take it back before the Reformation. And it's downright prophetic now. What we've got, obviously, what we've got is an American church and a South American church that aren't behaving. If you remember, John Paul II made his last really tragic and painful, it was excruciating to watch, trip just before his death, before the Parkinsonism got into South America, trying to defeat emergence, and Pentecostalism was what he called it, trying to bring it back in. Is the Catholic Church going to be the end? No. It will go on. I think one of the things we need to remind ourselves is that every time we've gone through one of these whoopies or rummage sales or whatever you want to call it, whatever held hegemony does not cease to exist. It just has to reconfigure. Catholicism didn't cease to exist with the Reformation. It did have to reconfigure. We call it the Council of Trent, right? Or the Counter-Reformation or whatever, all of that stuff. But it will survive this. What it's going through now is part of the emergence. And what Ratzinger is trying to do is take it back 500 years, which is exactly what the reinstitution of the Inquisition tried to do 500 years ago. Protestantism isn't going to end. We're going to reconfigure. I hope you know that week before last? Yeah, 2 weeks ago. The Reformed traditions and Lutheran Church in France gave it up and formed a new church, the United Protestant Church of France. It's a reconfiguration, simply because they could not survive independent of each other, though they deny that. It's absolutely true. So the Roman Church is going to be, but there's an ocean between us and Rome. And even though the world is flat, according to Friedman, it's hard to control over here. One of the funniest things that ever happened to me was that 5 years ago now, I guess, I was at St. Gregory at Nyssa in San Francisco. They were hosting for that whole area a program on emergence. It just happened to be a big church, and we could all meet there. And just as I was going up to the podium, the woman who was head of the venue said, now, there are 8 Roman priests in the audience, and they want you to know they're there. And I said, oh, that's lovely. I'll enjoy greeting them. And she said, no, you don't understand. They're females, and you can't greet them, nor will they be in costume at all or in clericals. And I said, I was unaware. And she said, oh, we have a in California, very active underground Catholic church, Roman Catholic, served by female clerics. And I said, oh, I had no idea. And she said, yes, we even have bishops who are ordaining them so that there is, apostolic succession. And 2 seconds later, I'm supposed to go up and talk and make some sort of, intelligence out of this. So I'm standing there saying, it's good to be with you. And on the second row just to my left, which is my way of saying to Ratzinger, buddy, you better watch out for those winking Catholic women. I think he's taken on more than he can handle. That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you.